They were afflicted by their captors. Let's just say the Japanese army didn't send its best men to these prison camps to serve as guards. And so you had a lot of, cast off Japanese and Korean brutes who had other places they'd rather be, and they were so miserable they took it out on these poor POWs for whom, Japanese culture consigns surrendered men to the dustbin. Basically, you've given up your dignity, you've given up your worth as a man. And so our guys were viewed that way. No matter how gallantly the Houston fought in sinking, her captured men had surrendered. The Japanese saw them, and they treated them with the brutality that was their due. So it's an incredible story of survival. And, the Houston is done away with about a third of the way into the book. And what you've got is a POW saga. And so it was a tough, my publisher wondered if audiences would come to such a dark story. And it is pitch black dark for long stretches of prose as these guys are going from camp to camp. What I've noticed is that the naval battle buffs gravitate to Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors and Neptune's Inferno, and people are more interested in kind of the psychology of endurance and human ordeals, and maybe a little bit of I'm picking up some of Laura Hillenbrand's audience from Unbroken as well. Brilliant book. But the audience is, not everybody is into these POW sagas because they're trying on readers that, obviously not in the same way as an actual human who was in its midst, but for readers, it's an emotional ordeal.
It is. And I think that, the whole, I don't know, was it BMI, right? There is a book called The Burma Road, Donovan Webster's book. It's been out for a long time. And,
yeah,
and I can honestly say that I did not know virtually anything about, General Stilwell and the campaigns and just really what went on in that theater. And it was a huge theater. And there was a lot that went on there. And a lot of, I think a lot of that part of the history of World War II is just, it's as fascinating and as riveting a history and a read as, to me is anything that's going, whether you're, the Pacific Theater or the European Theater. BMI was, but I'm just trying to think, the whole Burma India Theater. I'm trying to think, I don't know, probably mid 2000s or something. It was like, oh my goodness, there's a whole history here. And having, I did read that first before Ship of Ghosts, and it kind of, I thought, brought it all together. Just here's the campaign, here's what went on, and here's the people who suffered, really suffered at the hands of the Japanese. And but see, I told you we do go on these tangents, right? I could talk about gherkins and all kinds of stuff from here, but I'm going to stop. So it's just,
these locales are very remote.
Yeah.
From the perspective of ordinary Americans, we grew up vacationing in Europe. We know where Paris and Berlin and Vienna are.
Yep.
But very few people could pick Midway Island on a map, much less, Kolombangara or Guadalcanal or Tasafaranga or any of these other places. The China-Burma India Theater is about as remote as the Pacific gets from an American standpoint, right? It's just, it's out on the far side of the back of the beyond. And we have no familiarity with the locations. And so, no, it's a mystifying, these are mystifying cultures to Western experiences, and these are mystifying locations as well. And so naturally, I think it takes a special breed of reader to kind of be willing to untangle the polysyllabic names of locales and kind of straighten out the geography to wrap their mind around. It's a frontier. It's a frontier for Americans to invest themselves in this history. And so the ordeal of the Kachins and Burma or what have you, and it's very far. It's very far from Omaha, let's just say.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. Okay, you ready to move on to Neptune's Inferno? I did get that title right. First of all, that is a great title. I when I first saw it come out, I said, what could this be about? And then when you start reading about Guadalcanal, and there's been there's been quite a bit of books written, I think, on Guadalcanal. I know I've read a few, and it's kind of funny. One of my favorite movies was the James Cagney movie on Bull Halsey. Was it the Gallant Years or the Gallant Hours or something like that? But
the Gallant Hours, right?
Gallant Hours, yeah. It's a very odd telling and a very different way of filmmaking. But I think having seen that a long time ago, you know, I was always fascinated with Guadalcanal because all throughout the movie they're talking about the individuals, whether they're admirals or privates that got killed or that went on to different, you know, roles and jobs after World War II. It's just very different. Anyway, so my fascination with that, plus there was a very good book, Black Shoe Carrier Admiral, that talked about Admiral Fletcher. And,
right,
you know, sorry?
Yeah, I just mentioned John Lundstrom's, that's his
book.
Oh, John, terrific author.
Oh, and talk about detailed research. If you want to know how much fuel is consumed by the hour on a World War II aircraft carrier, that book will help you out too. I mean, it's incredibly detailed. And so, you know, all of that creates this big mosaic. And then you get Neptune's Inferno, and then it's like, oh, you did it again. You pulled us right into the events, you know, minute by minute, whether, you were a Marine or you were, or you were on the Atlantic, whatever, the San Francisco, all of it. It just was an amazing book and something, you know, when it was published, when it came out, you know, it was for me anyway, like a little kid, because after Ship of Ghosts, like I said, it was a very emotional read. This one equally emotional as to what happened, but again, I think another, you know, an incredible story of determination, courage, guts, and stick-to-itiveness, if that's even a word, to see something through. Like they would not give up this island at any cost. And I do believe, you know, you look at Admiral Halsey and his history, and he's got some you know, some blemishes on his record. There's no doubt. But this truly was an incredible story, I thought, through and through. So I guess same question: is it like the Leyte Gulf thing for you to really wanted to dive and get this whole picture out there for people to really dive into?
Well, you know, Guadalcanal was a whole campaign. It was a 6-month-long series of engagements, you know, fought over that godforsaken island.
Mm-hmm.
That gave rise to 7 major naval battles. 5 of them were sort of midnight surface actions, you know, 8-inch guns at 50 caliber machine gun range, just terribly bloody. And the other 2 were carrier actions, which nope, you know, 2 carrier battles that very few people remember: Santa Cruz and Eastern Solomons. So when I undertook the book, I had to figure out what story I was going to tell, because the cast of characters is changing, the rosters of ships constantly changing. And what I realized was that this was really the story of the surface Navy's learning curve in the art of combat. Even after Midway, you know, where World War II naval aviation finds its footing and lands this catastrophic blow on the Japanese, the surface Navy really hasn't seen major action against the IJN.
Right.
And so the idea that the decisive battle would happen at Guadalcanal was a surprise to both sides. The Japanese always expected it to be that they bleed the Americans and stage the decisive battle, you know, somewhere east of the Philippines, I guess. I don't know the exact locale, but it was, you know, the idea was to bleed the Americans as we pushed west.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the whole operation to invade Guadalcanal was this great kind of emergency improvisation when Admiral King realized what the Japanese could do with bombers based on Guadalcanal, namely cut off our supplies to Australia. He sent the 1st Marine Division south, and it precipitated this campaign of attrition. So the book was Neptune's Inferno. You know, I felt like it was a much more ambitious undertaking covering an entire campaign, and I had to figure out what story I was telling given the changing roster, changing cast of characters. And it crystallizes to a single statistic, one that surprises most people today. The statistic is that 3 sailors died at sea in naval battles supporting the Guadalcanal foothold than did soldiers on the island. So it was 3 to 1, sailor killed in action versus soldiers and Marines. Very few people know this at a time when, you know, there's a certain narrative about Guadalcanal that has the Navy fleeing in panic after the defeat at Savo Island, leaving the Marines utterly unsupported and on their own. you know. So my favorite opportunities to give speeches about Guadalcanal have been at Quantico. I've been down to Quantico twice to speak to the Marine Corps, and you know, these are mid-career officers and senior enlisted who are there at Marine Corps University studying. And so as part of the curriculum, they have a speaker series, and I've gone in twice now to talk about Guadalcanal. The first time I did it, I felt a little bit like I was walking into the lion's den, proverbially, except to find that really, after giving my talk on Admiral Callahan and Scott and all these great heroes of Guadalcanal, the sacrifices of the surface Navy in support of the island position, that the Marines were delighted to know that the Navy actually did have a fighting spirit, and that they had names they could point to that were as inspiring to the public as Chesty Puller and all these other great Marine heroes of the war, Basilone, and you know. The thing is, they're just not as well known. They're just not as well known. You know, Dan Callahan did receive the Medal of Honor, as did Scott posthumously. But you know, the home front, you know, again, as generally is the case, the public always has a hard time picturing naval engagements because we can't picture. It's harder to picture the maneuverings of ships at midnight than it is to imagine, you know, a guy hunkered down over a machine gun defending an airfield in a jungle. You know, we can picture that. We can imagine there are places to run. Naval combat is distant and remote from most people's experience. And so for whatever reason or another, and any number of reasons factor into it, including Admiral Nimitz's famous discretion and unwillingness to have dirty laundry aired in public, you know, the Navy never really got a story told, especially with respect to Guadalcanal, when the Marine Corps made kind of a battle cry out of the fact that the Navy had dropped them off and run for cover. So the mission of this book was to flesh out the narrative, the kind of the 6-month story of how the Navy traversed its own learning curve in combat and ultimately paid a price that frankly dwarfed the price paid by the ground services in support of the island that was, after all, the object of the first Allied offensive anywhere in the world in World War II.
Well, you captured it beautifully. It's an incredible read, and mission accomplished, right? I had always kind of, I don't know, maybe because I've been a sailor for a long time. You know, I one of the things I looked up a long time ago was, well, just how many sailors died compared to Marines, right? And many more sailors died holistically in the war. I can't say specifically to Guadalcanal, but it was just one of those things that's like, you know, there was huge sacrifice because there's a, you know, obviously the services are all different, and there's great rivalry. I think there's a heck of a lot more respect now in this environment of jointness that you know, that it doesn't matter as long as you're in the fight what your name tag says, whether it's Army, Navy, or Air Force or Marine Corps, running after things. Right. But you know, it was when I first enlisted, the rivalries were really heavy. I think Colin Powell did a lot of work to kind of form into you know, more joint, and then after 9/11, when you know, they had blue to green programs, you had this, you had that, and probably just from, you know, your discussions with Marcus Luttrell and others, you realize that, you know, nobody really cared anymore what branch you were as long as you were in the fight. But back then, that really hung over the heads. That was hung over the head over the Navy for quite a while. And so I think you did a great service there in really highlighting that. And you know, I think for all sailors, you know, we take a lot of pride in our history, and you know, most of it comes from these events. And Guadalcanal, I think, was, you know, you could honestly say it was both the Marines and the Navy's finest hour at the end of the day. And the way it ended, I think, was, you know, like you said, you know, it ended with the battleships of all things. You know,
well, that's right.
You know, finishing it off. But
yeah, there were only 2 battleship-on-battleship engagements in the entire war. One of them was at Guadalcanal, and the other was at Leyte Gulf. And so you know, for all the naval officers and planners who thought that the next naval battle was going to be a replay of the Battle of Jutland, it was much to their surprise that things turned out differently. And so, you know, so Guadalcanal stands as kind of a case study of the surface warfare sailor really having to figure out the ancient art of his craft, and mastering, frankly, you know, learning to beat the world's reigning master in the art of nighttime torpedo warfare, i.e. the Japanese Navy.
Oh, yeah.
The way we did that, you started out mentioning Halsey. This was the